talking about what other people have written about a class of Roman pottery also called Arretine, found in Britain, also found in Germany and Gaul from the end of the 1st century BC onwards. I'm taking a view of these early Roman red slip pottery vessel forms. In Britain it's chalices, other decorated bowls, plain plates and cups. A view that's very much informed by the historiography of the subject, which has been accumulating for 170 years in this country. All of this historiography, I argue, has had an effect on our present day views, indicating not only that we continue to wrestle with both the issues of what these purely Roman tablewares, as opposed to Gallo-Belgic and Gallo-Belgic influenced pottery, means in pre-conquest Britain, the siren call of what I call conquestiness in terms of the date range of these things. The abstract is slightly wrong in saying post-conquestiness. And also that an interpretation nowadays of this Italian type sigillata as part of the material culture of very pre-43 AD Romans in Britain seems more and more reasonable. It's been 40 years since I turned up here, a few streets away, to do my first job in British archaeology. I wasn't very good. I tried the patience of the saintly Dr. Timby, and I was often shouted at by the irascible keeper of archaeology, who's not the present one, in the Sydney Museum. But all of us survived. And more seriously, that time 40 years ago was when the current becoming Roman, staying Gallic paradigm for the late Iron Age to early Roman transition in Britain was beginning to be set, with major projects like Silchester Forum Basilica and the ditches at Badgington, both of which I visited from here on field trips run by what was the Gloucester and District Archaeological Research Group. Moving then to Essex after a year or so in the West Midlands, I even had some of my own Italian type sigillata to study and got the late Geoff Daniel to report on it for me. I made tables of it and other late Iron Age imports in Essex in the approved Hazelgroovian prestige goods style. So I've long had an interest in my subject today, if an unfocused one, as I move physically further and further away from the Belgic heartlands, ending up in Scotland. Eventually though, I was brave enough to buy a copy of the great modern stamp corpus Oxay, Comfort and Kendrick, and I was very much impressed by Philip Kenrick's plotting of Britain appearing out of nowhere in the distribution of stamped Italian type sigillata in the period roughly 20 BC to AD 15, and then disappearing again from the maps just as quickly. Now clearly, while his broad periodization was a working hypothesis, and those periods that he used were of unequal length, this British pattern, just looking at the graphics, was something different enough from that obtaining in adjacent northern Gaul and the Rhineland, which saw earlier small-scale beginnings before 20 BC, and later equally small-scale continuation the other side of the date range. And as there hasn't been really any review of the Italian type sigillata in late Iron Age Britain for a long time, 2002 perhaps, and never one that paid much attention to the impact and the agency of what those who reported on it thought they were seeing, I began the present work that I'm presenting as an interim statement today. Now importantly, in the late 1980s, Andrew Fitzpatrick critiqued current orthodoxy about what the small quantity of imported goods in late Iron Age southern Britain meant, that they imply in any way trade, in inverted commas, commerce with or inspired by the Roman state, and that changes over time in the settlement system, like the decline of hill forts, were due to an increase in this trade as a destabilising influence working through a typology of sites and social institutions. And he prophesied in 2001 that it is the less dramatic factors which will help to move studies of the Iron Age away from a focus of the Great Divides like urban and non-urban, tribe, state, hill fort, oppidum, internal or external exchange. He looked to more nuanced interpretations to come. Historiographically, our story starts back in the late 1840s when the London archaeologist Charles Roach Smith had read the recent work published by Antonio Fabroni of Arezzo, newly published as the first study of Italian-type sigillata anywhere. And Roach Smith realised that there were likely to be British finds of this material, on a why not basis. And when he gave a paper to the British Archaeological Association on the subject of Samian pottery found in Britain more generally, he was able to add notes on 2 pieces of just this Italian-type sigillata, which he claimed were from London. Now this is the dark side of the historiography, because this is the beginning of a false trail where genuine pieces of sigillata were given false London provenances by intermediaries, not by archaeologists like Roach Smith, culminating in an extremely naive presentation of the accumulated London material in the later 1920s by Oswald and Price. This is before any rescue excavations were actually possible in the City of London. Luckily succeeded by a careful dismantling of the alleged London corpus in the late 1970s by Geoff Marsh, after a critical eye had at last been turned on it, and after the first large-scale excavations of genuine early Roman sequences were available for study. From a pottery archaeological point of view, the historiography of Italian-type sigillata begins in March 1852, when the Cambridge botanist and antiquary Cardale Babington read a paper to the Cambridge Antiquarian Society on a group of Roman pottery vessels recently found near Foxton, about 11 kilometres southwest of Cambridge. And Babington wrote, "In the month of February, a man ploughing in a field in the parish of Foxton placed his foot into what he supposed to be a rat's hole, but which a search proved to be the mouth of a large amphora placed upright in the ground. The man and some boys dug this out, and on the arrival of the farmer at the spot, had it set up and were preparing to amuse themselves by knocking it into bits with stones. This the farmer prevented, and sending to Cambridge, informed Mr. Deck, a local antiquarian, of the discovery. That antiquary immediately proceeded to the spot, and causing careful search to be made, he obtained numerous proportions of round dishes and the shattered remnants of an ornamental bowl, quoted to us to have formerly resembled the well-known red Samian vessels. And this ornamental bowl, when reconstructed, was found to be Italian-type sigillata, one of the chalices. Babington compared it again to other local finds of red pottery and sought an informed opinion. He said, "I'm informed by my friend Mr. A.W. Franks," that's Franks of the British Museum, "that it is a specimen of what is denominated Arretine ware, from its being supposed to have been made at Arretine in Italy. The softness of the material shows that it must have been intended as an ornamental bowl solely, as it would not have borne use." The Antiquarian Society had the chalice reconstructed in plaster, connected together, as they say, to convey an idea of its original appearance, and made it the subject of a very beautiful and correct drawing by a Miss Dayton, representing the pot as if perfect again, and reproduced in the publication, and it remains one of the treasures of the Cambridge University Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. The circumstances of discovery were not, as I've set out, ideal, so that Isaiah Deck, the antiquarian, had to exert himself to recover as much of the pottery vessels as possible once their destruction had begun, rather than being able to investigate the context of the burial further. He had to stop the stone throwing. And because Cardale Babington, knew of no local Roman sites or Roman roads around Foxton, he felt it unsafe to speculate as to context. He said, "Having no clear idea of the intention of those who placed the amphora, and doubtless also the other vessels so carefully in the ground, it is useless to theorise on the subject," he wrote. A great number in subsequent years of other British finds followed from other parts of Cambridgeshire into Oxfordshire, Wiltshire, Hampshire, Dorset, Essex, Hertfordshire, through to all the major sites like Badgington, Silchester, Camulodunum of late Iron Age Britain, but also a handful of rural sites and burials. And German archaeologists like Emil Kruger, who became one of the excavations of Arretine, a significant site for the study of Italian type sigillata full stop, became interested in the British material alongside Francis Haverfield and his proteges, suggested dates for the British pieces, for example, circa 10 BC to AD 10 for the Foxton 1852 find, began to emerge in the early 20th century. But there was also need to contest some excessive attempts to redate and explain away the British Italian type sigillata, so that Haverfield's own paper of February 1916 to the Cambridge Antiquarian Society on British finds of this material began by explaining that I was lately turning over the always interesting pages of the Cambridge Society's publications, a great cemetery of buried and too often forgotten treasures. But reading the original paper, he realised that the stamp could be properly read on one of these pieces, was able to do so, and in pursuit of that he borrowed the material from the site at Barrington and produced a new account of the Italian type sigillata cup from there, which he dated to around 10 BC to AD 10 or 0 BC to AD 15. And regarding the British context of this sort of material, Haverfield was critical of another German archaeologist, Emil Ritterling, who was writing in his Hofheim report that fragments such as this were brought by private persons from Italy to the island of Britain after it was invaded in AD 43. So the conquestiness is beginning. And instead, Haverfield argued that any theory needed to, in his words, account for the rather large quantity of Arretine found in this island, large at all events in comparison with what used to be thought. Now, at this date in 1916, he's obviously still influenced by what we now know not to be a large volume of Italian type sigillata from London, but that there was the Silchester picture was beginning to build up. So if you look at his words, it's not necessarily a reflection of actual reality at the time, but a prophecy of the future, our present day. It is correct that there is just too much Italian sigillata to explain away as all coming late on as heirlooms. So he added that, nor can it be called very likely that an Italian would hoard an unadorned cup, so that he or his descendants should convey it 30 or 40 years later to our remote province. Haverfield also criticised yet another German archaeologist, the great name for Italian type sigillata, August Ochse, who conjectured around 1912 that, I quote, the Arretine pieces found in Britain came from a Roman ship carrying some troops of Germanicus, which was, as Tacitus records, wrecked on the British east coast about AD 16. So Haverfield noted, I don't see why a chance ship in a military expedition should be laden with Samian pots or saucers, and nor will the theory explain earlier pieces at Silchester. Haverfield said, I would rather suppose that the pre-Claudian potsherds, alike at Silchester and his find at Barrington in Cambridge, came over by way of trade. After Caesar's conquest of northern Gaul, Britain came into fairly close touch with Rome and Roman civilization. And it seems certain that between 55 BC, Julius Caesar, and 43 AD, Claudius, Rome influenced British things a great deal. And slightly tongue-in-cheek he ended, that there was before the Claudian conquest on the banks of the Cam, half a dozen miles above Cambridge, a Celtic population prosper enough to use some of the finer products of continental civilization. Shall we call it a forerunner of modern Cambridge? As the 20th century drew on, it began to be appreciated that some of the things that were lumped in with Arretine, Italian type sigillata, that superficially looked like it, were in fact not. There were more early pots in South Gaulish Samian coming into Britain. Come the 1930s, appreciation of this greater representation of pre-conquest South Gaulish material led to sensible reclassifications of Arretine, but also a slow drift away from this 0 BC to AD 10 date ranges to ones like AD 10 to 30, which are getting attracted to the magic date of AD 43. It culminates in a strong conquest period attraction that we see in a very negative fashion in the interpretation of assemblages like Cameo-Dunham in the 1930s and Fishbourne in the 1960s and 1970s. Older members of the study group will remember Val Rigby telling us of the great battle that she had to convince people in Chichester that Barry Cunliffe was wrong, that everything wasn't just conquest period, there was a pre-conquest period, and then bold Malcolm Lyne bust right through that with the recent work at Fishbourne. But that was a serious problem which had roots back in the 1930s, if earlier. So the sense from the historiography of Italian-type sigillata is important always, right from the start. It's been something that Britain must have, Britain ought to have there. So there are those who think we ought to have more, went out looking for it, identified some, misidentified other harmless pieces of Central Gaulish salmon, etc., as being Italian-type sigillata. And there are those who thought that we shouldn't have any at all. The stuff, the scholars that Haverfield was fulminating about, explaining it away as the shipwreck or the heirlooms. So that this contrast, Italian sigillata is important. It's either important and we've got to have it, or it's so important you can't have any of it at all. Straightforwardly, in archaeological practice, the careful attention to context and associations is a line that connects those studying, for example, Foxton in 1852 with those publishing Newbury Community Hospital in 2008. If easier for the latter than the former. And the dogmatic assertion of the conquest period often ignores context, associations, and the work of German and French researchers. So right at the beginning, Roach-Smith was plugged into hot new continental research, but Britain began to drift away from a serious interest and a serious reading of the works of people who were studying the same material just the other side of the channel. So lastly, looking into the immediate future, the text-based approach that I've taken here continues to come to our aid, I think, letting us escape from the too narrow concept of purposeful relations between people and artefacts. When thinking of things like, for example, the large Italian-type sigillata platter cut down for the lid of a local cremation urn at Heybridge, well away from any of the oppidum or town sites. So something like the Heybridge pot and others like it in Italian are independent actors in their interactions with people in other networks than the ones that are to do with trade or with official Romans bringing their material culture when they're posted to Britain from Germany. That is to say, things acting beyond their original acquired purpose. Back to that cut down platter having a cultural biography that encompasses a second life or a third life as a lid. Beyond the force of being created, moved and used as vessels. There's no need for conquestiness, let alone post-conquestiness, or single explanations nowadays of Italian-type sigillata. Enter the theory of things and exit Colin. Thank you.